Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event hosted by the Institute for Electronic Arts at Alfred University. My name is Miranda Metcalf, and I'm the director of the IEA. Before we begin, I would like to consciously, intentionally recognize, acknowledge, and honor that Alfred University sits on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Onondaga people, otherwise known as Great Hill people. With a proud and rich history, the Seneca Nation of Indians, also known as the Keepers of the Western Door, are the largest and westernmost of the 6 nations that constitute the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Nations, a democratic government that predates the United States Constitution. Today, I am delighted to introduce to you our current artist-in-residence, Chris Fritton. He has been with us since January 22nd through our artist-in-residency program, which is supported by the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ralph C. Wilson Foundation, the New York State Council for the Arts, the Shine Joseph Endowment, the School of Art and Design, and the Department of Expanded Media at the New York State College of Ceramics. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris Fritton.
Thank you. I wouldn't clap yet. You guys haven't heard me speak, so you have no idea if I'm any good at this. First off, I do want to thank IEA and Miranda and Thomas Logan, who's been helping me out all week long. I wouldn't have been able to do all the things that I was able to do this week without them. But without further ado, let me tell you why I'm here. In case you don't know me, my name is Chris Fritton, and in 2014, I quit my job. That is not the unusual accomplishment you will be seeing. I quit my job and I hit the road. I hit the road and I started a project called the Itinerant Printer. And in the space of about 2.5, almost 3 years, I traveled the entire country visiting different letterpress print shops. And all told, I visited 137 shops, 45 states, 4 provinces, and I covered almost 50,000 miles. And in case you think that that's the Great American Road Trip, I also got 11 parking tickets, 4 speeding tickets, 6 missed toll tickets, and I got the car towed twice, once in San Francisco and once in Seattle, which are probably the 2 most expensive places to get your car towed. Now, before I tell you more about the Itinerant Printer project, I think I gotta back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about letterpress printing. Everywhere I traveled, I carried this little passport, and the passport, just like your passport, I'd stop in the shop, I'd pick something out of their collection, and we'd stamp off on it. But what on earth does that mean? All right, here's your crash course in letterpress printing. All letterpress printing is relief printing, meaning you're printing the raised surface of a block as opposed to the recessed areas. It's a lot like a stamp. The kind of letterpress printing I do involves movable type. Movable type can be made of different materials, and it is often made of wood like this, metal like this, and then in addition to wood type and metal type, we have border material, which is exactly what it sounds like, ornament material, and what we call cuts. And cuts can be made of anything, really. They can be made of metal, they can be made of wood, they can be made of linoleum, and they can also be made of magnesium or zinc, like this Tickle Me Elvis up here. Now that can be made using a photo process similar to screen printing so that you can almost get photorealistic relief printing. They can also be made by hand, like this little bunny here that's headed out on an adventure. Now, the objective of letterpress printing is to take all those disparate objects, whether it's wood type, metal type, border, ornament, or handmade cuts, and bring them together into a form for printing. The form involves all the printable objects along with all of the spacing, usually referred to as furniture and leading. After you got your form together, you take it to a press. This is a clamshell press or a platen press. In addition to these, you can also use larger presses, like a bed press. This is a Vandercook here for doing larger prints. And the only thing a press does in the entire world is facilitates inking the form and bringing a sheet of paper in contact with the form after it's been inked. Comes together, and then the ink touches the page, and you get a print. A beautiful print like this, right? But not so fast. Letterpress printing, just like screen printing and everything else, happens normally 1 color at a time. So if I'm going to print a 5-color poster, I would actually use 5 different forms, and I'd print 1 color probably on each day. So to make a gig poster like this one, I'd print the yellow, different form, print the pink, different form the blue, different form the orange, and then close it all out with the black. Now, what do I do with letterpress printing? I actually got my start as a letterpress printer, as a writer and a book artist. In the 80s and 90s, I was making a lot of zines. They were dealing with skateboarding, punk rock, all kinds of stuff like that, and I would just Xerox the insides, staple them together at Kinko's or whatever. I always wanted to improve the quality of those, so I learned how to screen print, and I would screen print the covers, and then I would digitally print the insides and still just staple them together. But eventually, I found letterpress printing. When I found letterpress printing, there was something about it that clicked with me. It's like building the language from the inside out. With movable type, every single sort, every single character is its own individual piece. So as you assemble a sentence, you're actually taking every letter in every single word in every single sentence in, say, a stanza in a poem, and you have to put it together one piece at a time. It's like the architecture of language. And I was really enamored by that, so I started to letterpress print the covers for chapbooks and things like that, smaller books of poetry. Then I eventually moved on to learning how to letterpress print the entire book. Then I started to experiment with different forms, and I'd do artist books like the Baltimore Catechism here, this book called Illuminata. I got to work with a lot of amazing people out there. This is Pulitzer Prize winning poet Carl Dennis. I also got to work with American artist, reasonably famous Richard Tuttle, to make his first book ever. All letterpress printed, all handmade. So I actually got my start in letterpress printing as a writer, like I said, and a book artist. I was doing what they call fine press printing for the most part. But what do I do now with it? Mostly gig posters for bands, event posters, other things like that. I do a lot of mid-level indie bands because I like to make money for them as well as make money for me and not give the money to record labels and other people like that. I deal with a lot of cool bands like Sleater Kinney of Montreal, Dead Kennedys for any punk rockers out there. But when I'm on the road, I can't really get gigs like that. I can't, land an event poster or a gig poster. So what I do is I create art prints. Now, the only thing that I bring on the road with me is paper and ink. So I'm working exclusively from the collections that those shops have, whether it's wood type, metal type, or other materials. And within the space of about a day, it's design on the fly. I have no idea what they're going to have in the shop. Sometimes I don't even know what kind of press they have. So I have to be able to take those elements, pull them together, and create something in a really short period of time. So often I will use type like you just saw, or I'll use cuts that they have to create these art pieces. When I was out there on the road, I had to standardize a couple of things, and one was that every poster was going to be 12 by 18, and every postcard that I did for smaller presses was going to be 4 by 6. And you might have noticed already that a lot of letterpress printing that I do doesn't really look letterpressy. If you were to see this in real life, you might think it's a lithograph, or you might think it's a screen print. And I do that intentionally. If any of you are familiar with letterpress printing, you're probably familiar with things like Hatch Show Press, really heavy, blocky wood type, really super saturated colors. And I think from an early sort of stage in my career, I was trying to take letterpress printing in a different direction. But before we talk about that, I got to talk about why I started this whole thing. Now, believe it or not, this whole notion of an itinerant printer, or what they call a tramp printer, or some guys in the business call a traveler, is actually a historical notion that's based on what used to be called the International Typographical Union. They convened the union right before the American Civil War. So around 1860, they pulled the union together, and if you get a union card, you could actually travel anywhere in America and pick up a job. So you could be in Cincinnati for a couple of weeks and work there and then quit, and move to Oklahoma City and work there for a couple of weeks and quit and move on to the next place. The union was actually so strong that if there were hours to be worked, there was a clipboard on the wall. You could walk into a union print shop, you'd show them your card, that was like your golden ticket that said you had the skills to be there, and you'd have a job. I would even read accounts of guys getting a job, quitting at lunch, walking down the street, and picking up a job at another place. I read all these accounts, they're first-hand accounts mostly, from tramp printers. They would write books about their adventures. And we'd be cleaning out some old print shop somewhere, and I'd scoop up a book about tramp printers. I got really fascinated with this idea that they became these kind of analog conduits for information as they traveled around the country. You got to picture them kind of like Johnny Appleseed. So when they go from place to place, they bring tips and tricks about printing. They bring rumors. Did you know this guy died? These two companies merged. That place closed up forever. Well, prior to radio and television, that was one of the fastest ways for that information to travel. Now, There's no longer an international typographical union. I couldn't expect anyone to pay me a wage, so what I do now is a lot more like a mid-level touring band. As I travel around North America, I pick up gigs like this. I also stop at all kinds of schools and universities and give talks and presentations. I stop at hobby shops and smaller print shops, and all along the way, the things that I make become my merchandise. So the prints that I make here, if I sell some, I get enough money to go to the next place, and so on and so forth, just like a touring band. And it's allowed me to go some amazing places. Because I have a lot to get to today, I'm going to blow through some of this pretty fast, and if you guys have any questions, you can find a lot of it online, or you can ask me afterwards. But I've been able to go to so many cool print shops, and this one here is actually the Chantilly Press that's down in coastal Georgia. Incredibly beautiful building. They're renovating the main building. They have an outbuilding that's a print shop. This is Menagerie Press that's out in Terlingua, Texas, way down in southwest Texas near Big Bend National Park. And that's an Adobe building that the woman Lauren Stedman, who runs the print shop, rebuilt herself. You can see in the upper corner there where there's new Adobe bricks in. And when you're printing in there, you can actually look out the window and straight at the Chisos Mountains. So it's like this amazingly romantic, beautiful place to print. Lots of community shops along the way where I teach workshops and other things as well. This is Atlanta Printmakers Studio. This is my friend Smoky Road Press down in Georgia as well. This is an incredible architect space in Somerville, Massachusetts, technically kind of Boston, and that's run by my friend Eli. As you can see, these little pop-up shops everywhere I go, give a talk at night, tell you what I've been doing, tell you where I've been, tell stories about it, and show you the work from the road. So every single one of these prints that you see on the screen right now were made at different places, different times, using different materials. Sometimes I'll even do outdoor fairs and things like that, but not as often. Now, where did I start? January 26, 2015, Buffalo, New York. This is my home base right here. That's literally January 26, 2015. And I went as far southeast as I possibly could, just like bands do, to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. That is Fort Lauderdale, Florida, January 26, 2015. So obviously the right move for me there. And while I was on the road, I made 15,000 prints, over 15,000 prints. But like we said, because you can only print one color at a time, this probably involved more like 45,000 or 60,000 impressions. 12 by 18 poster size pieces like this, 4 by 6 postcard pieces like that. All told, I think there was somewhere between 300 and 400 different designs that I had to concoct when I was out there. And we could talk about it a little bit later, but I think that probably anywhere from 25 to 50% of them were visual failures because I didn't have enough time to do what I wanted to, or the idea that I had just didn't work out. So there was a lot of practice there that made me pretty modest, pretty humble. All told, I worked on 34 different kinds of presses, and you can see that a lot of the things that I worked with would be regional. You get to Montana and Wyoming and places like that, and they have all kinds of cuts of cowboys. You get down to Florida, there's all kinds of cuts of dolphins and alligators and things like that. Now, I'm going to skip through some of these, just showing you some materials that I made so that we can move on to what I did at IEA and some other stuff as well. These are all wood cuts and wood engravings from West Virginia. Now, what do you do after you've been on the road for 3 years? You visit hundreds of shops, you make tens of thousands of prints. You write a book, right? Everybody's like, write a book. It'll be great. It was the worst time of my entire life. Even though my entire background and all of my degrees are in philosophy and English literature and all of my background is in writing, it was an incredibly difficult time because I know just enough about Adobe to be dangerous and I know just enough about it to lay out my own book, but I'm definitely not a virtuoso. The book, I like to call my 7-pound baby. This thing's 12 inches by 12 inches. It's 320 pages. It's 1,500 photos. It's about 130,000 words, and it's a story of my entire life on the road for that 3-year run. Now, the book itself is really a labor of love. Each print shop got its own spread. They would feature things that I made there or just things of local interest around town. So it's not just necessarily print porn. It expands out into a lot of armchair sociology and all kinds of other stuff. And that was a fascinating part of a lot of those itinerant printer things that I would read early on. these guys were a little bit like parachute journalists, where they would just drop into a place, and they'd just be like, Kansas City's full of drunks and whores. And I'd be like, whoa, really though? Now, what I did wasn't necessarily as provocative or controversial, but it was definitely a lot like parachute journalism. I'd have to be in a place for a day or two, and I'd have to get a sense of it and come out the other side with a story about it. And it allowed me to, I think, see a lot of those places, luckily, through other people's lens, because when I was on the road, I would stay with a lot of the printers. I became kind of a surrogate member of their family for a short period in time. And then they would tour me around and take me to places. So it wasn't necessarily that I was a complete outsider. I feel like I did get the inside track on some of these places. But when you read the articles, a lot of times they do read like parachute journalism. Now, I didn't take any notes when I was writing the book. I didn't take any notes when I was on the road, and that was intentional. I wanted this to be the story of my trip. I had absolutely no interest in creating an encyclopedia of print or an encyclopedia of print shops. I just wanted it to be the story, and it may or may not be the way that it happened. So I wrote this entire book from memory. And I'm pretty proud of it, but it's completely sold out. There's a couple more on the table out there, but that's literally like the last box. Now, how did I end up here today? I'm going to give you the whole arc of my career, and then we're going to wrap up with what Thomas and I literally just finished, 5-10 minutes ago. So early on, I actually had a kind of itinerant printing trip. My friend Amos Kennedy lived down in Alabama, and when I went down there, I stayed with him for like a week, and we just printed every single day and made dinner every single night, and it was wonderful. I actually slept in the print shop, and when I was there, he had a series of cuts of image blocks from an old illustrated dictionary from the late 1800s. I took those, I put them into a form that was 8 by 10, I layered them in 3 colors, and I ended up with this. So technically, all the way back in 2011 or 2012, this was my very first itinerant print that I made out there at someone else's shop. And you can see that it actually has some of the, I guess what I would consider motifs of my later printing. It's very abstracted, very thin filigree lines, and very bright colors. So that's where that started, and then it kind of merged into the stuff that I do for gig posters and other things. Then I started doing these quote posters, but you might notice from the photographs, and you may have noticed when you're walking in, looking at the pop-up shop, that all the backgrounds are one of a kind. And that is what I refer to as an ink wipe. These ink wipe backgrounds are absolutely one of a kind, and technically they used to be the sheets that we'd use to clean the press at the end of the day. So if you ran pink that day, you'd throw some solvent on the press, you'd run a sheet of paper in it, and you'd have pink and solvent kind of runny and all over the page, and then you'd let it dry. Tomorrow when you printed with yellow, same thing. Next day, blue, same thing. Well, eventually, started to look at these as works of art unto themselves, started to just leave them alone, as opposed to just using them as backgrounds for these quote prints. That's really when I sort of like jumped the shark and started making this Gerhard Richtery kind of work using the press that is made specifically for letterpress. This is important to me because for me, letterpress printing is about where it's going in the future. It's not necessarily about where we've been, and it's not necessarily about being a novelty. That's what I was talking to you before about hat show print, where it's very recognizable. I love the idea that the things that I make on presses that are intended for letterpress printing don't look anything like letterpress printing. The best analogy I can give is with painting, and I say this all the time to students. If we didn't have someone that looked at their tools differently, then we'd probably still be doing a lot of hyper-realistic portraiture from the 1400s and 1500s and on. And it's not just because those painters chose different subject material, it's also because they looked at their tools and they said, how else can this thing make a mark? When I walk into a studio now, whether it's the press itself, whether it's the type or other things, I say, how else can these things make a mark on the page? And then I end up with this, and you end up with, at that point in time, Impressionism and Expressionism and Abstract Expressionism. And this is Abstract Expressionism, what I call painting with the press. It still does have some typographic elements depending on what's on the page, but for the most part, I leave these guys alone. Then I started taking these in, creating paper sculptures, where I would chop them up and do these 3-dimensional pieces. It's kind of difficult to tell from there, but each of those pieces is separated by, about 1/2 inch. This was a fun project that I started right around 2020 at the beginning of COVID, and I was making what I would call these ephemeral sculptures or temporary sculptures. So these paper sculptures only exist in photographs. They were never made, they were never glued together or anything. I would make them, crank through a couple of days, and just see how it turned out. So this is an example, time lapse, of how those temporary sculptures are made. That actually ended up becoming almost like a maquette for a larger project I did later. Now the quote prints, like I said, are kind of like my bread and butter, the things that people recognize, but this is something else I do with the quote prints, where I take frame by frame stop motion animation, and if there's 50 of those prints, your optokinetic tracking wants to keep the text where it is, but then the background changes. So I've created quite a few of those as well, and that plays into what I actually did here at IEA as well. So you can see it's pretty multi-purpose and it's very rudimentary. I do not pretend to be someone that knows a considerable amount about technology or animation, but it really suits the work that I'm doing. And I do it with visual pieces as well. When I'm out there on the road, I like to collaborate with other people because I cannot draw to save my life. I'm not illustrative by nature. So when I find someone who can or is a woodcut artist, I like to pull my palette together with their skill set and do things like this. This is from my friend Bobby, who runs a shop called Just a Jar down in Marietta, Ohio. You can see how it kind of activates the piece in the exact same way. Now, I did start doing a lot of fully abstract work with these ink wipes as well. You can see just experimenting here with translucency and transparency. Some of these were originally set to soundtracks, but I kind of like them quiet as well. I did an entire alphabet when COVID was happening too. You can click through this little guy where it's just like using those ephemeral sculptures to create alphabets. And again, more collaborative work with friends along the way. This is my friend Tim Tanker, who's from Hartford, Connecticut, now lives up in Maine. And then I started doing a series of really traditional letterpress prints just recently too, kind of like coming full circle back to where I started. Some of the original prints that I ever made over 20 years ago were what I called poster poems. And this is kind of a return to that poster poem setup. Each one of these means something. If you guys are interested in what, feel free to ask me after when we're hanging out by the pop-up shop stuff. I like to integrate technology with what I do, and that's why I was so excited to come here to Alfred. From the earliest stages in letterpress printing, I was trying to figure out how to use laser cutters and how to use 3D printers as well, and use those to create wood type in a really affordable fashion, as well as wood blocks for printing, again, to create primarily abstract work. Really cool project that I did with a company in London that I'm going to breeze through really fast. It's called Mr. Jones Watches. I was able to take old wood type and use it to create the design for a watch. I don't know if you guys know what an interrobang is, but it's a character that merges an exclamation point and a question mark. And this right here, the question mark is the hour hand and the exclamation point is actually the minute hand. So it goes around and once an hour, they connect and make an interrobang, just like that. And this was a cool setup because every single one of those dials that you just saw on the watches back here was printed by hand by me in the shop. A rainbow roll like this, took those discs, mounted them up, and as I rolled the press forward, I was actually able to print every single face of the watch and have it all be one of a kind. Then I shipped them to London for assembly. Again, this is a way for me to integrate different technology, but also look at the press and the form, the way that the press is set up differently. Came out in a second series as well. Did the back as well. Now, some of the stuff that I've been doing recently that I'm really excited about is more street art stuff. I was kind of bound up when I was doing Itinerant Printer under the thumb of this brand that I had created, and I was also kind of caught up in the commodity of it all where I have to print these posters and then have to sell them, so I really wanted to do something that was not for sale. So I got together with my friend Chris Chandler. He lives out in Portland. He makes these monster pieces using these monster woodcuts. We brought my palette to it, did all this fluorescent work, and then I get together with my friend Max Collins, and we visit all the abandoned grain elevators and other spaces in Buffalo, and slap together these massive outdoor installation pieces like this that are not for sale and usually fall apart within a couple of months or get covered up by someone else. This has been a way to kind of free myself from that brand I created and free myself from that commodification of my work. The wheat pasting process, if you don't know anything about it, is just like wallpaper, and it's really cool because the paper will take on the texture of whatever you put it on, whether it's concrete, whether it's diamond plate steel like this. Started doing the project that was almost like gates and doorways as well. Huge mural that I did, exact same process with the exact same people, but this was down in Marietta, Ohio. You can see how it takes on the actual texture of the cinder block that it's on. And you can even wrap it around objects that you find. This is a huge one that I did on the outside of the concrete central grain elevator in Buffalo. That's about 16 feet high, 16 by 8. Indoor as well. That gives you a sense of the scale compared to the grain elevator itself. A lot of the large-scale work that I've been doing is still abstract and still ink wipey, but taking it more into the fine art realm as opposed to the printing realm where I find myself more often. And remember I told you those paper sculptures became like a maquette for something, like a model? I actually got to design a bunch of pieces for an apartment complex in Buffalo recently, and I used panels. These are 24 by 36 inches, and they're mounted up dimensionally, just like those paper sculptures. So I had no idea that those stupid little sculptures that I was making to keep myself from being bored during COVID would turn into this project, where it actually fills the entire building. This is the 10-second walkthrough of that whole space. You can see that there's pieces at the end of each hallway. And then once we get upstairs, there's also pieces that incorporate visuals like pattern drawings and maps and other things. I was able to ink wipe over top of those. All of those correspond to the space they were in. It's an old industrial building. They used to produce machinery, and we had some of those patent drawings as well as the patent applications that we used. And again, this is just a way for me to sort of expand on letterpress printing and what people think of letterpress printing. Now, this part's kind of important. I'm going to sink into it. I'm going to get my phone out so that I know exactly how much time I got. When I first started this trip, I thought that the entire thing was about printing. I thought it was about the type I was going to find along the way. I thought it was about being able to sort of fund my own journeyman time in my career, get out there and actually learn from the people on the road, where I would stop in their shop and I could cherry pick their best ideas, and then I could use it to improve my own technique, etc. And what I realized right away is that it wasn't about the type and it wasn't about printing at all. Even though there were all these amazing examples of it, this is a little bit of type porn for everybody, but at the same time, this was secondary. When I was out there, I realized that the entire trip was really about people, because people are the ones who carry the knowledge of the craft. And without those people, I would have never been able to achieve my goals in terms of traveling around the entire country, but I never would have learned the things I learned. So I didn't just drop into an empty print shop, I dropped into a space that was occupied by another human that knew considerably more sometimes than I did. And one of the stories that I have goes all the way from the beginning of that trip to the end, and this is the important one. And it involves my friend Ingrid. That's the very first shop that I visited in 2015 down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And then the very last shop that I visited, that's my friend John Selikoff, who lived in Orange, New Jersey, just outside of Princeton. Now, this was 2017, and I'm at Princeton, and when I was on the road, a lot of people would get a hold of me, and they'd be like, oh, I got a print shop here, you know, you should come and visit. And when John got a hold of me, I was like, oh, I am wrapping this thing up, man. I'm headed home, I'm gonna write the book, I'm kind of done, you know. And he was all like, I'd really like it if you could come by my shop. I'm not gonna have it that much longer, but I'd love for you to see it. And I was like, I don't know if I can fit it in, you know, it's just too much. And he's like, I'd really love it. We could keep it super low key. We'll just bring out like 5 or 6 of my friends. We can print together. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. You know, let's do it in a couple of days. And he invited out a few friends, just like we said. I come to his shop, but before I got there, I sent him an email, and I was all like, you know, you said you're not going to have your shop much longer. What's going on with it? You know, is it too expensive? That happens to a lot of people. Do you have to move? And I was like, I can probably find a good home for this stuff, you know, if it needs to go somewhere. And it got really heavy really quick. I had no idea. John wrote back to me and he's like, actually, I have ALS and I'm sick. And he was like, I'm not going to be able to print very much longer. And he's like, when you get here, the disease has actually taken my voice already, so I'm going to use a little text-to-speech app. And I was like, holy shit. That got like super dark, super quick, and I had no idea. So I suck it up, I go there, I decide like John and I are gonna have this super magical day, and we do. I learned all these amazing things about him. One was that he was a metalhead, and all we did was listen to like Metallica and Black Sabbath and stuff all day long, which was great. We made these amazing prints that you see here out of 10-inch Cooper Black wood type. And I don't know if you guys have ever used or talked to someone that uses like a text-to-speech app, but it's kind of cumbersome. Like if I ask you a really long, complicated question, I kind of have to stand around and wait for you to type out the answer, and then you can play it for me. So what I started doing with John was asking him a whole bunch of yes or no questions. You know, I'd ask a really complex thing, but then I would distill it at the end to yes or no, and he figured out what I was doing. And a lot of times he would answer yes, but then he would walk away and he would type like a whole paragraph, and he would come back, and just to be a smartass, he would play it in like a robot's voice or a girl's voice. And that was pretty awesome. So we ended up making a whole series of 10 of these, and then I headed home and I started writing the book. I spent the next 8 or 9 months in a single room just cranking out the book. And right before it was going to be published, because I wanted to fact check everything, I started to send everyone their little bit of the book. And I was like, I don't need any style or grammar advice. I literally just want you to fact check this to make sure that it's right. So, of course, every single human being that I wrote to wrote back to me with a bunch of style and grammar advice. And, you know, I heard from most people, but there were a few like slackers, and I never heard from John, and I was just kind of like, all right, so I followed up with them. And I followed up with them again. Then I started texting him, and I'm getting nothing. And I'm just like, I wonder what's going on. It gets to be January of the next year, and I get a message from John's wife, Lauren, and it says, John passed away on Thanksgiving Day. And I was just like, fuck. Like, he's never going to see the book. He was this huge part of it. He's like the capstone of the whole thing. He bookends the whole thing, you know, and he's never even going to see it. And I was so disappointed. And Lauren said to me, you know, we still have all of John's stuff, and we have absolutely no idea what to do with it. We don't know what anything's worth. We don't really know anything about it. It was John's stuff, and it was kind of like his thing. And she said, will you come down and sort of assess it all and let us know what it's worth and what we could possibly do with it? And I was like, yeah, of course. So within a week, I went back down to Orange, New Jersey, and I spent the next 2 days in John's shop just listening to metal the whole time, and I inventoried every single thing in his shop. And I made a spreadsheet. I went back home, and I was like, I'll get a hold of you guys, and I'll let you know what I can find out and what I can figure out. So I get home, and before I even send this information to anyone I know, I get an email from Ingrid, the first one that I visited on the trip. And it's like, hey, I want you to come down to Florida. I want you to do a workshop, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, P.S., I'm looking for a Vandercook SP20 or some similar press. And I was like, no shit. That's the exact press in John's shop. So I put Ingrid and John's family in contact, and over the course of about 12 months, Ingrid was actually able to acquire John's entire shop as what we call a legacy shop. So now it lives on inside her shop as what we call the John Selikoff collection. So kind of like a snake eating its tail. That's the story of how the very first shop acquired the very last shop that I visited on the trip. And none of that would have ever happened without the people that were involved and without me hitting the road. And there's one more part to this that's a little bit hard to tell, so bear with me. When I went into shops, the things that I chose to print with were two. They were either something you printed with all the time so it would be representative of your shop, or something that you never printed with and you just never thought of it. Or I'd pull open a case and there would be this thing that you'd never seen. Well, the reason that we printed with this 10-inch Cooper Black wood type is because this is what John used to use to make his son Sam birthday presents. So when he turned 1, he printed him a 1. When he turned 2, he printed him a 2, so on and so forth. Now, when I went down to inventory the shop, Lauren said to me, well, I guess that tradition's over. There's nothing we can do. What I ended up doing is taking all the Cooper Black wood type home with me. And now, every single March 23rd, when it's Sam's birthday, I'm the one who prints the numbers for his birthday using the exact same type that his dad did. So it seems like the perfect example to me, going from the beginning of my trip to the end of my trip, that shows you that the human sort of side of this was the more important side than the printing side. Now, here's an example of the prints that I make for Sam. I usually wrap up with this, but today we're not going to because I got to talk about what I did here at Alfred. The universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. Now, this is not me. This is a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. And when I saw it, I was like, man, I have never seen something so true in my entire life. And what I usually advocate for when I wrap up my talk is going out into the world and working with other people, even if you have to cold email people and cold call them, do what I did with the Itinerant Printer strip. No matter what your medium is, no matter what medium you're working in, if there's someone that you like their work, get a hold of them. See if you can work with them. See if you can visit them. What it does in the end, even though the universe as a whole has no obligation to make sense to you, it can make this small corner, this small pocket of your world make sense to you. Because you're gathering that expertise, you're creating that network of people. And I think that I have a lot more to say about craftsmanship, but we got to move on to what I did here at Alfred. Now, this is probably going to blow you guys' mind in the way that it doesn't correspond with anything I was just talking about. Okay, hang in there with me. It wasn't even a month ago, and I was on Instagram, and I saw this clam that you are looking at right now. And this is called a hieroglyph clam, and I had never seen one before in my entire life. And I was immediately blown away. I'm like, it looks like language on the outside of that clam. It looks like runes. It looks like, probably not hieroglyphics, but more like cuneiform. And I was fascinated by it. So I started to learn about how the clam creates these designs. And the weirdest part was no one really knows, but they have theories. And the theories are based on what they call cellular automaton. I didn't know anything about this at all. I am not a mathematician. I do not purport to be a scientist or a mathematician, so I'm going to give you guys the basics of this as far as I understand it. If any of you guys are mathematicians, feel free to let me know what's going on and what I get wrong. But the idea behind a cellular automaton is you have a series of what we can just call cells up here. Let's think of it as a binary. One's black and one's white. There's a series of rules up there across the top. If you have all of those together and they're all black, that's going to say live. And then you have the next one where we have 2 black and 2 white, that will die out. And when that happens, you apply these rules to a series of cells. What it produces is almost completely random. There are certain patterns in it, but it's difficult to really tell what's going to happen next. And I was fascinated by this idea. I think this next slide is like a GIF that sort of illustrates what I'm talking about. So you can see as the different cells start to interact with one another, there is a pattern to it, but you have to imagine this is an incredibly regular form that we're witnessing right now. So obviously it repeats. Obviously it creates this really understandable pattern. Okay, now let's try to imagine it when you introduce a cell that wasn't part of that pattern. You just slap another one in there, or like it would be in nature, it wouldn't necessarily be as regular. They believe that maybe some of the cells produce a different chemical, and that's why we get the color on the outside. That's why you get the contrast between the light and the dark. They think maybe some of the cells die, and when they die, that's what produces the contrast, and no one's really figured this out yet. So the light bulb moment was when I realized that language and the independent components of language, like letters, are just like those cells. There are a finite set of an infinite variable. So we have a finite set of those 26 letters in our alphabet. Each one itself is infinitely variable, but then they're also infinitely recombinable. So what I did when I was here at Alfred is I used the huge etching presses and I set up the alphabet to make these monster prints. And I know you guys are probably still like, what does this have to do with the clams? I don't understand. And it's like, I didn't really at first either, but I knew that I was onto something. So what I started doing is printing the alphabet, but I had to create a series of rules for myself. Now the rules that we saw in the other ones involved black and white, right? The binary between those two. Well, the way that you create that in printing is by folding the paper. So I created a series of rules for myself, however arbitrary, by folding the paper and slapping it on top of the type and then printing it. And then you would get these incredibly strange abstract shapes that end up being kind of runic, a little bit like cuneiform, and you can see where the folds, that's the rule that we were talking about, sort of the mathematical rule that says you print here and you do not print there. And then what I started doing that makes this a little bit more analogous to what we were just seeing in terms of the set of rules for the gameplay back there is creating stop motion animation out of these again. You can see the parallels between this and between the GIF that I just showed you guys. Now, true to form though, I had to do things that sort of looked like the work that you're all familiar with. So I folded up the sheets and I printed on ink wipes, just like these guys here. This was super fun too. And then made stop motion out of those guys too. Now, here was my greatest disappointment. I had this idea that it was going to get better and better as it went. So try to imagine with me, I would fold the sheet of paper up and I would print on it. Then I would unfold it, I'd refold it in a different configuration, and I'd print on it again. Step and repeat. Fold it up again, print on it again. What ended up happening that I didn't expect at all, that did feel like a failure, is the prints got less interesting as they went. The more the page filled up with the second pass and the third pass, it really started to, at least to me, get a lot more visually boring. And I was disappointed by this next run. I was kind of like, all right, I get it. It just kind of felt like a one-trick pony. When we go back to the ones that I showed you that were just like a single wedge, they felt far more active, but they felt far more like a riddle, and they felt far more analogous to the clams that I was looking at. So what I did is I headed down to the wood shop and I spent some time with Cooper. I needed a therapy dog at that point in time because I was like, I have no idea what I'm going to do from here. Because, like I said, I thought the prints were going to get better, but I thought that was going to be my final product. And what I had done by printing over them again and again is I'd eliminated the best ones. That was the first pass, and they were all gone, kind of like when you make a suicide print in woodblock printing. I couldn't get them back. All I had was the photographic index of them. So Coop brought me around, and then what I decided to do was something that harks back to some of the earliest work I was telling you about, and I set a poem instead. I made a huge poster poem, and I went back to the drawing board. And I was actually able to set it right on the press bed here, pull out the alphabet, standardized A to Z like it was, and wrote this poem. This says, "Follow me into the harness of the world and back, and pick supple guns I may carry." You guys are probably like, what the hell does that mean? I don't understand. That's okay, I probably don't really either. It's because I was working with a finite number of sorts. So there was only a certain number of letters. And in order to make the poem fit the entire form, I had to use whatever letters were there. And this was about all that worked. So creativity within constraint, but also, like we were talking about, like another set or series of mathematical rules that was imposed on this project. So what I did with these guys, created these backgrounds. So we printed 3 sheets of paper at the same time, the folded one, the top half and the bottom half, and it allowed me this negative space. And you can see they're all here, feeling a little more clam-like, folded up like that. And this is them unfolded. And again, I think far more visually successful than the pieces that get full of type. Then I started doing a little stop motion animation, unfolding and folding them like origami, flopping them over, closing them up. Now the last couple of things I did, and then we'll break for questions and whatever you guys want to do, is employed the Rezo upstairs and wanted to make a couple of zines to go along with this. I've never thought of any of my work as a series of single objects, and I've never thought of any of my book work as just a book. I always try to expand a book into something larger, like a stage set or a series of large prints, and I always try to distill something like a series of large prints down into a book so that we have these correspondent pieces. And Thomas was nice enough to show me how to use the Rezo and then also help me crank out a ton of these bad boys upstairs. And the result was 2 different books, 2 different zines. One is called Alphabet Automaton, like we were just talking about, and that involves primarily the alphabetical ones. I had a really fun moment last night at like 9 o'clock at night when I was working on this book, where instead of having the text jive, like you see there, that I flopped it over and I printed it topsy-turvy like this, and it looks 100 times better. So we did all the rest of the zines topsy-turvy like this. And then the second one is the poem, and that is the one that's the Follow Me into the Harness of the World. So we were able to actually crank this out and just finish the last pages a couple minutes before I started this talk. That's it. That is everything that I did at Alfred. That is where it all came from. That's what I did with my life before I came here, and I'll give you guys the shortest version in the world of what I'm doing with my life after this. Literally headed to San Francisco tomorrow morning, out there to the Codex Book Fair, and then I landed a really cool gig at Pixar, where I'm actually going to be teaching a workshop and giving a presentation out there for their designers and some of their non-creatives as well. So I got to put all my stuff in my car and head out tonight, and then head out to the West Coast. So this is your moment. If you have something to ask me about this project, about any of the projects you saw along the way, about the traveling project, really anything. So I want to thank you guys for spending your Thursday afternoon with me. I know a lot of you guys are here because you're in a class or are obligated to be, but those of you who aren't, I really do appreciate it. I know you could be doing anything you want right now, and it's cool that you came to spend some time with me. So thanks for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.